The scent of roasted chicken, usually a comforting aroma in their home, felt heavy and suffocating that evening. Amelia gripped the stem of her wine glass, the smooth, cool surface doing little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Across the polished oak table, her mother-in-law Judith held court. Her voice, a crisp, authoritative instrument, sliced through the quiet clinking of cutlery. Thomas, her husband, sat beside her. Amelia could feel the warmth of his leg pressed against hers, a silent anchor in the turbulent waters of a dinner with his mother. He shot her a quick, reassuring glance, his eyes soft with an understanding that had been their saving grace for the past 5 years. But even Thomas's quiet support felt like a flimsy shield against the storm that was Judith. "The garden is looking a bit wild, Amelia," Judith commented, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a pristine white napkin. It wasn't a question or a suggestion, but a verdict. "I remember when Thomas was a boy, this house was always immaculate. His father and I made sure of it." Amelia forced a smile. "I've been a bit busy lately, Judith. The freelance project I took on is demanding." Judith waved a dismissive hand, the large diamond on her finger catching the light. "Oh, that little computer thing you do. It's sweet that you have a hobby, but a home is a reflection of the woman who keeps it. Thomas works so hard all day at a real job. He deserves to come home to a place of peace and order." Each word was a carefully aimed dart. Amelia felt her cheeks flush. Her little computer thing was a graphic design business she had built from scratch, a business that was now contributing significantly to their household income, a fact Judith conveniently ignored. She had been working 14-hour days for the past 2 weeks to meet a crucial deadline, often falling into bed long after Thomas was asleep and waking before the sun rose. Lazy was the last word she would use to describe herself. "Mom, Amelia works incredibly hard," Thomas interjected, his tone firm but respectful. "Her business is doing really well." Judith simply smiled, a thin, knowing smile that made Amelia's stomach clench. "Of course, dear. I'm just saying, a woman's first priority is her family and home. It's easy to get distracted." She then turned her full attention to Amelia, her gaze sharp and critical. "Honestly, Amelia, it seems to me you've become quite lazy, relying on my son to carry the weight of this household while you play on your computer." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The clinking of forks stopped. The soft music playing in the background seemed to fade away. Lazy. The word echoed in Amelia's ears, a raw insult that dismissed every ounce of effort, every late night, every sacrificed weekend. She felt a familiar sting behind her eyes, the burn of unshed tears of pure frustration. She had tried for years to earn this woman's approval, to be seen as worthy of her son. But it was a battle she was always destined to lose. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to list the endless tasks she juggled, but the words caught in her throat. What was the point? Judith's mind was made up, but then something shifted. The quiet, steady presence beside her moved. Thomas placed his napkin deliberately on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. Instead, a calm, almost cold resolution settled over his features. "You know, Mom," he began, his voice even and clear, "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements slow and methodical. "But since you've brought it up, I think it's time we looked at some facts." He pulled out a folded stack of papers. Amelia watched, mesmerized, as Thomas unfolded the papers. They weren't receipts in the traditional sense. They were spreadsheets, meticulously organized and printed in neat, clean columns. A shiver of disbelief went through her. She had no idea he had been doing this. Judith scoffed, a brittle, sharp sound. "Thomas, what on earth is this? Are you playing some sort of game? Put those silly papers away." "They're not silly, Mom," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They're records. I started keeping them 3 months ago, after our visit in June. You might recall you told Amelia then that she should find a more productive use of her time. I realize that opinions are easy, but facts are stubborn." He flattened the first page on the table, turning it slightly so both women could see the clear black and white print. "Let's start with the financials, since you seem to believe I'm carrying the entire weight of this household." His finger traced a line across the top row. "This is my take-home pay for the last 3 months. And this," he moved his finger to the line just below it, "is Amelia's. As you can see, her little computer thing has not only matched my income for the past 2 months, but in August it surpassed it by 20%. Her freelance project, the one you find so quaint, is paying for the new roof we need, something we wouldn't have been able to afford until next year on my salary alone." Amelia's breath hitched. He had never laid it out so plainly. They managed their finances together, of course, but seeing the numbers presented as a defense of her worth was staggering. Judith's eyes narrowed, scanning the columns as if searching for a flaw in the logic. She found none. That's fine. Money isn't everything. A home requires presence. I'm so glad you brought that up, Thomas said, his voice seamless as he slid the first page aside to reveal the second. Because I've tracked that too. I call this sheet time and labor. It's a log of household management hours: cooking, cleaning, laundry, grocery shopping, paying bills, scheduling appointments, all the invisible work that makes a house a home. He began to read, his tone as neutral as if he were delivering a weather report. July 12th, Amelia worked a 10-hour day. She also cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and prepared lunches for the next day. Total household labor, 3 hours. My contribution, I took out the recycling. July 19th, Judith, you called at 4 p.m. asking for help setting up your new tablet. Amelia was on a hard deadline, but she drove over, spent 2 hours with you, drove back, and then worked until 2 a.m. to make up for the lost time. I made toast for dinner. He continued, a relentless chronicle of Amelia's effort. He listed the nights she stayed up balancing their books, the weekend she spent single-handedly painting the guest room, the constant, draining emotional labor of remembering birthdays, buying gifts, and maintaining their social calendar. Amelia felt tears welling in her eyes, but for the first time in Judith's presence, they weren't tears of frustration. They were tears of overwhelming, heart-stopping gratitude. He saw her. He saw all of it. He hadn't just been a silent, comforting presence. He had been a witness. He had been keeping score not to hold it against her, but to hold it up as a shield for her. Judith's face, which had been a mask of condescending superiority, was slowly turning to stone. Her mouth was a thin, hard line. The color had drained from her cheeks. Thomas paused, looking directly at his mother. The calm in his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. This is a summary of just 1 week, Mom. There are 12 more just like it here. So please, tell me again about how lazy my wife is. The silence that followed Thomas's challenge was a living thing. It was heavier than the scent of roast chicken, more solid than the oak table they sat around. Judith's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. Shock was there, clear in the slight widening of her eyes, but underneath it was a deep, simmering rage. Her authority, the unquestioned matriarchal power she had wielded for decades, had been publicly dismantled with spreadsheets and facts. She finally found her voice, but it had lost its crisp, cutting edge. It was brittle, thin. "This is a monstrosity," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "To spy on your own wife, to count her every move like an accountant. What have you become, Thomas? This isn't how a family operates. This is cold. It's insulting." "What's insulting, Mom?" Thomas replied, his voice still level, "is consistently belittling my wife. What's insulting is ignoring her contributions and calling her lazy when she is the hardest working person I know. I didn't do this to spy on her. Amelia had no idea I was doing this." He turned to Amelia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of apology in his gaze. "I'm sorry, Ames. I didn't want to make a spectacle of this, but I couldn't sit by and let her talk to you that way anymore." "Not again." Amelia reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers intertwining with his. "Don't be sorry," she said, her voice full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was love, magnified and intensified, a fierce, protective wave that mirrored the one she saw in his eyes. "Thank you." Judith looked at their joined hands, and her expression soured even further. She saw a united front where she had expected to find a crack to exploit. "So this is her doing," she spat, abandoning her earlier shock for pure venom. "She's turned you against me. She's filled your head with these modern, nonsensical ideas about partnership. A wife's place is wherever she chooses it to be," Thomas cut in, his voice rising for the first time. "And Amelia's place is beside me, as my equal. Not beneath me, and certainly not beneath you." He began to gather the papers, folding them with the same deliberate precision he had used to present them. The finality of the gesture was unmistakable. "For years I've hoped you would see her for the incredible woman she is. I've made excuses for your comments. I've tried to keep the peace. I told myself you just needed more time. But I'm done with that." He stood up, his chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. Amelia stood with him, a single, unified movement. "This dinner is over," Thomas stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You have insulted my wife, you have insulted our marriage, and you have insulted this home. A home she works tirelessly to build with me. I think it's time for you to leave." The command was absolute. For a moment, Judith looked as though she might argue, as though the sheer audacity of being dismissed from her own son's home would provoke another outburst. But as she looked at Thomas's resolute face, and then at Amelia, standing tall and unwavering beside him, the fight seemed to drain out of her. Her formidable facade crumbled, revealing something Amelia had never seen before on her mother-in-law's face: defeat. Without another word, Judith slowly rose from her chair. She picked up her handbag, her movements stiff and aged. She walked toward the front door, her back ramrod straight, but it was the straightness of pride holding off a complete collapse. She did not look back. The sharp click of the front door closing echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the house. For a long moment, neither Amelia nor Thomas moved. The remnants of the disastrous dinner sat on the table: the half-eaten chicken, the cooling side dishes, Judith's perfectly folded napkin, a stark white flag of a battle Amelia hadn't even known was being waged on her behalf. Then a sound escaped Amelia's lips. It was a choked sob, a mixture of relief and a dozen other emotions that had been dammed up for years. The strength that had held her upright in the face of Judith's scorn wavered, and her knees felt weak. Thomas was there in an instant, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. Amelia buried her face in his chest, and the tears she had refused to shed in front of Judith came in a hot, cleansing flood. She wasn't crying from hurt or anger anymore. She was crying from a place of profound, earth-shattering love. "I can't believe you did that," she murmured into the fabric of his shirt. "I couldn't let her," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He held her tighter, stroking her hair. "I couldn't let her diminish you like that. Not one more time." They stood there for what felt like a long time, simply holding each other amidst the ruins of the evening. The tension that had been a permanent resident in Amelia's shoulders, whenever Judith was near, finally began to dissolve. When her tears subsided, she leaned back to look at him, her hands coming up to cup his face. "The spreadsheets, Thomas," she said, a small, wondrous laugh bubbling up. "Really? You made spreadsheets?" A sheepish grin touched his lips. I know. It's the analyst in me. I deal in data all day. It's how I make sense of things." He led her to the sofa, away from the accusatory gaze of the dinner table, and sat down, pulling her with him. He picked up the folded papers from the coffee table where he'd left them. "The day after she visited in June," he explained, his expression growing serious again. "The day she told you to find a productive hobby, I saw how much it hurt you. You tried to hide it, but I saw it. And I was so angry. Angry at her, but also angry at myself, because I felt like I wasn't doing enough to defend you. Telling her she's wrong just becomes an argument. I knew that to get through to her, if it were even possible, I couldn't use opinions. I had to use undeniable facts." He unfolded the papers again, but this time they didn't feel like weapons. They felt like a testament. "So I started writing things down," he said softly. "At first, it was just about the money, to prove your work was more than a hobby. But then, I started noticing everything else. All the little things." His finger traced a line on the time and labor sheet. "Look at this. August 2nd. Amelia spent 45 minutes on the phone with the insurance company to dispute a claim. I did not know this was a thing that needed to be done. Or this one. August 10th. Remembered my dad's birthday and ordered him a gift. I had forgotten." He looked at her, his eyes full of awe. "I thought I saw everything you did, Amelia. I thought I appreciated you. But I didn't. Not really. Not until I started writing it all down. It was humbling. I realized you were carrying a weight I wasn't fully seeing. All this invisible work that just keeps our lives running smoothly. And I was just floating through it." Amelia took the papers from his hands, her fingers tracing over his neat handwriting in the margins, the little notes he'd made. It was the most romantic thing she'd ever seen. It was a love letter written in the language of spreadsheets and data entry, a detailed, quantifiable account of her value, not just to the household, but to him. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her heart aching with love for this quiet, methodical, wonderful man. "But I'm so glad you did." She needed to see it, he said simply. "And maybe," he added, looking at the papers with a new understanding, "I needed to see it too." The next morning, the house was different. The sunlight that streamed through the kitchen window seemed brighter, less apologetic. Amelia stood by the coffee maker, listening to its familiar gurgle and drip, and realized it wasn't the light that had changed. It was her. A weight she hadn't been fully conscious of carrying had been lifted. It was the weight of constantly bracing for impact, of perpetually trying and failing to measure up to an impossible standard. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He said nothing, simply breathing in the scent of coffee and the quiet peace of their home. It was a peace that felt earned, fought for. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. "The best morning," he replied, and she knew exactly what he meant. The tranquility was interrupted an hour later by the ringing of Thomas's phone. They both tensed. Amelia's eyes darted to the screen as he picked it up from the counter. The name displayed was Dad. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He exchanged a look with Amelia, a silent question and a nod of support, before answering. "Hey, Dad." He listened for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Amelia could only hear the faint, muffled sound of his father's voice on the other end. "I imagine she is," Thomas said finally, his voice calm and steady. He walked over to the window, looking out at the garden Judith had criticized. "No, it wasn't out of the blue. It was the result of years of her making Amelia feel unwelcome in her own home. Yes, I did. I called her lazy. Because that's what she did. She called my wife lazy after Amelia has been working tirelessly for our family." Another pause. Thomas let out a long, slow breath. "Dad, I understand she's your wife, but Amelia is mine. I have to protect my family, and I won't have her or anyone speaking to her with such disrespect." Amelia's heart was pounding. She was hearing only one side of a conversation that would define their family's future. She was preparing herself for an onslaught of anger from her father-in-law, for accusations of being disrespectful, of tearing the family apart. But Thomas's next words surprised her. "The spreadsheets? Yeah, I did that." His tone wasn't defensive, it was matter of fact. It was the only way to make it clear. "She deals in accusations, so I dealt in facts." He was quiet for a full minute, listening. Amelia watched as the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, replaced by something akin to relief. "Okay," Thomas said, his voice softer now. "Yeah, I appreciate that, Dad. I really do. We're fine. We're good. Okay. Talk to you later." He ended the call and stood for a moment, his back still to her. When he turned around, his face was full of a complex mix of emotions. "What did he say?" Amelia asked, barely breathing. "He said my mother was furious," Thomas began. "Said she told him I ambushed her and that you had turned me against her with radical notions." Amelia's stomach dropped. "Oh, Thomas, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," he said, stepping forward and taking her hands. "Because that's not the most important thing," he said. He listened. He let me explain everything. And then he sighed and said, "Your mother is a force of nature, son. It's a hard thing to stand in her way." And then he told me that he'd seen how hard you worked, that he knew you were a good woman and a good wife. He said I did what a husband ought to do, protect his house. Thomas's voice cracked slightly with emotion. He said he was proud of me. Tears pricked Amelia's eyes once more, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. They hadn't been cast out. They hadn't been abandoned. Thomas's father, a quiet man who rarely intervened in Judith's affairs, had understood. He had sided with them. The battle with Judith had created a wound, but the validation from his father was a balm. It was a sign that the foundation of their family was not built on Judith's approval, but on their own shared truth. And for the first time, that truth felt powerful enough to withstand any storm. 6 months passed. Autumn's crisp air gave way to the quiet chill of winter. The new roof, a tangible symbol of Amelia's success, sat sturdy and strong atop their house, no longer a point of financial stress but a source of shared pride. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by a profound and peaceful silence. There had been no calls from Judith, no angry texts, no dramatic confrontations. After the dinner, she had simply excised them from her life, a surgical removal that was as cold and precise as her criticisms had once been. In the early weeks, Amelia had felt a pang of guilt, wondering if they had been too harsh. But that guilt was always quickly replaced by the memory of Judith's face, not in anger, but in that moment of condescending dismissal just before Thomas had pulled out his papers. It was the memory of years of small cuts, of 1,000 moments of being made to feel small. The silence from Judith was not empty. It was filled with peace. Amelia found herself breathing easier, her creativity flowing more freely. Her business, unburdened by the mental weight of her mother-in-law's disapproval, flourished. She hired her first part-time employee. She took on bigger clients. She was not just a woman with a little computer thing. She was a founder, an artist, an entrepreneur. And she was thriving. Thomas's father, true to his word, became a quiet bridge. He would call Thomas weekly, and at the end of each call, he would ask to speak to Amelia. He asked about her work with genuine interest, remembered the names of her clients, and praised the pictures she posted online of her design projects. He and Thomas started a new tradition of meeting for lunch once a month, just the two of them. And sometimes, he would stop by the house on a Saturday afternoon with a bag of pastries, just to say hello. He never mentioned Judith during these visits, and they never asked. His presence was its own statement. This family, his son's family, was still his family. One chilly December afternoon, Amelia was in her home office, finalizing a major project. Thomas walked in, holding a small, elegant envelope. "It's for you," he said, his expression neutral. Amelia's heart gave a familiar little skip of anxiety. It was from Judith. Her perfect looping handwriting was unmistakable. It wasn't a Christmas card. It was too early for that. With trembling fingers, Amelia opened it. Inside was a single, crisp note card. It read, "Amelia, I have been informed that my son's birthday is approaching. I trust you will ensure he receives the cashmere sweater he likes from the downtown men's shop. Size large, navy blue. I will reimburse you." That was it. No greeting, no apology, no acknowledgement of the chasm that lay between them. It was a directive, an order from a superior to a subordinate. It was Judith, unchanged, unyielding, and utterly incapable of seeing Amelia as anything more than an extension of her son. Amelia looked at the card, and she didn't feel anger or hurt. She felt nothing but a distant clinical pity. She looked up at Thomas, who was watching her, his jaw set. "She still doesn't get it," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond this single note. "No," Amelia said, and then she did something that surprised them both. She laughed. It was a genuine, liberating laugh. "No, she really doesn't." She walked over to her desk, took out a pen, and flipped the note card over. She wrote a single sentence. "Thank you for the suggestion, Judith, but I've already bought Thomas's gift." She slid the card back into the envelope and handed it to Thomas. "Mail that for me?" A slow smile spread across his face, one of pure admiration. "Absolutely." That evening, they stood in the backyard, looking up at the silhouette of their home against the twilight sky. The first frost of the season glittered on the lawn. "Thank you," Amelia said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "For what?" "Mailing a letter," he joked. "For everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For seeing me. For pulling out those ridiculous, wonderful spreadsheets. You didn't just defend me that night, Thomas. You showed me that my work, my time, my effort, it was all visible. It mattered. Not just to me, but to you." He turned and wrapped her in his arms, holding her close against the winter chill. "It always mattered, Amelia. I was just the fool who needed data to truly appreciate it." He kissed the top of her head. "A person's worth isn't determined by the opinion of others. It's forged in the truth of their own effort and the respect of those who truly love them. I respect you more than anyone I know." In that moment, under the quiet gaze of the winter stars, Amelia understood that this was the real victory. It wasn't about the spreadsheets or winning an argument. It was about this partnership, this unbreakable respect. This home, built not just with wood and nails, but with the invisible, invaluable labor of love, a labor that was finally and fully seen.